Hey guys, today we are diving into the topic of severance of joint tenancy under Singapore law. If you are a property owner or planning to be one, this is crucial information you will not want to miss. First, let's briefly explain what joint tenancy is. In Singapore, joint tenancy is a form of property co-ownership where two or more individuals hold a property jointly. One key feature of joint tenancy is the right of survivorship. This means that when one joint tenant dies, their share in we call it inverted commas, automatically goes to the surviving joint tenants. Therefore, the estate of the joint tenant who dies first receives nothing in the property because the ownership rights of the dead joint tenant are automatically taken over by the surviving joint tenant by operation of the doctrine of survivorship. So the right of survivorship will cease to operate when there is only one surviving owner left. In such a case, it becomes sole ownership. So when the sole owner dies, his ownership rights, since he's a sole owner, it will be distributed in accordance with his will, if he has a will, or in accordance with intestacy law if he doesn't have a will. So why would someone want to sever a joint tenancy? Well, firstly, in Singapore, it is quite common for married couples, husband and wife, when they purchase a property, because they do not understand this legal concept of joint tenancy, the right of survivorship, tenants in common. They don't understand. It is common for them to purchase property as joint tenants without knowing the consequences down the road. Okay, so one of the reasons for wanting to sever means cut, okay? Cut the joint tenancy, because when two people hold property as joint tenants, there are no shares. They hold it as something like one unit, okay? There are no shares. When people refer to shares, they're referring to holding property as tenants in common. That is a different concept. Therefore, one of the main reasons for wanting to convert the ownership structure from joint tenancy to tenancy in common is to allow each owner to have a distinct share of the property that can be passed on according to their will or in accordance with intestacy law. Now, let's talk about the procedure to sever a joint tenancy in Singapore. This process involves a few key steps and specific documents. The first step is to prepare a notice of severance. This notice must clearly indicate the intention to sever the joint tenancy and convert it into a tenancy in common. The notice should be in writing and must be served to all other joint tenants. This can be done via personal delivery or registered post. Step 2. The person wanting to sever the joint tenancy must make a statutory declaration. This is a sworn statement declaring his intention to sever the joint tenancy. The statutory declaration must be signed in the presence of a commissioner for oaths or notary public. Step 3. The instrument of severance. This legal document formalizes the severance of the joint tenancy. It should indicate details such as the names of the joint tenants, the property in question, and a clear statement that the joint tenancy is being severed. Finally, the completed instrument of severance, along with the statutory declaration, must be lodged with the Singapore Land Authority. The Singapore Land Authority will then update the land register to reflect the change from joint tenancy to tenancy in common in the respective proportions. It could be 50%, 50%. It could also be 30%, 70%. It could be 20%, 80%. Now let's talk about mutual and unilateral severance. The severance of a joint tenancy can be either unilateral or mutual. Unilateral means one-sided, and for unilateral severance, this requires a service of the severance notice on the other joint tenant. In the case of mutual severance, it does not require the service of the severance notice. It is important to note that unilateral severance of a joint tenancy can only change the co-ownership to tenants in common in equal shares because it is not by consent. Because the two owners hold it as one unit. So if the other doesn't consent and one wants to sever the joint tenancy, can only be done into equal shares. That means 50%, 50%. However, if the severance is mutual, that means both of the joint tenants agree to the severance. The co-ownership can be held in unequal shares as tenants in common. For example, 40%, 60%, 50%, 50%, 30%, 70%, or even 10%, 90%, because it is by mutual consent. Let's recap the specific documents involved in the severance of a joint tenancy. Number 1, notice of severance. Written notice has to be served to the other joint tenants. Statutory declaration, which is a sworn statement of intention. Instrument of severance, a formal document of severance. Number 4, lodgement of the documents to the Singapore Land Authority. And there you have it. Severing a joint tenancy involves several steps and specific documents, but it's a manageable process if you know what to do. The legal fees to sever a joint tenancy can range from as low as $300 to as high as $1,000. You have to just ring up and call the various law firms to inquire their charges. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more legal insights.